horrifying
then let's go
stories.
to the thing that is most discussed about you, I think, is the fact that the color of your skin is obviously different than it was when you were younger.
Yes.
And so I think it has caused a great deal of speculation and controversy as to what you have done or are doing. Are you bleaching your skin? And is your skin lighter because you don't like being black?
Okay, number one, as I know of, there is no such thing as skin bleaching. I have never seen it. I don't know what it is.
Well, they used to have those products growing up. I used to hear, always use bleach and glow, but you'd have to have about 300,000 gallons to...
Okay, number one, this is the situation. I have a skin disorder that destroys...
1958. A baby boy was born in Gary, Indiana to Catherine and Joseph Jackson. They named him Michael. Nobody in that small house on Jackson Street could have known what that name would eventually mean to the world. Nobody could have predicted what that child would become. And nobody could have imagined that decades later, questions about that family's bloodline, their genetics, and their biological history would become one of the most debated topics in entertainment history. The Jackson family was always defined publicly by what they could do. The music, the performances, the talent that seemed to run through every member of that household like a current. But beneath the performances and the fame and the decades of headlines, questions about the Jackson family that went deeper than music began to surface. Questions about health, about inheritance, about what their DNA actually carried, and what it revealed about the family that produced one of the greatest artists who ever lived. When those questions were finally examined seriously, when medical records and biological research and the accounts of family members were placed alongside each other, what emerged changed the way serious researchers understood the Jackson story. Not just Michael, the whole family, the whole line, what was passed down, what was carried, and what it ultimately cost. September 3rd, 1950. Catherine Scrouse married Joseph Jackson in Gary, Indiana. It was a modest beginning for what would become one of the most famous families in American history. Gary was a working-class city. Joseph worked at a steel mill. Money was tight, and the house on Jackson Street was small for a family that would eventually include 9 children. What that household had in abundance was music. Catherine played piano and guitar. She sang. Music was present in the Jackson home not as entertainment but as something closer to a language, a way of being together, a way of expressing things that the daily pressures of working-class life in 1950s Indiana did not otherwise leave much room for. Joseph Jackson recognized early that his children had something. He pushed them hard. By the accounts of every child who grew up in that house, rehearsals were not optional. Standards were not negotiable. The discipline was strict in ways that left marks that several of the children spoke about publicly for the rest of their lives. But something else was also present in that household that nobody talked about in those early years. A pattern that would only become visible much later, when the family's medical history was examined alongside the extraordinary physical and psychological demands they all lived under. A pattern written into their biology that shaped their lives in ways that none of them fully understood until long after the damage had been done. The Jackson family carries a genetic condition called vitiligo. This is now documented and confirmed. Michael Jackson's autopsy in 2009 verified that he had the condition.
When did the color of your skin start to change?
Oh boy, sometime after Thriller, around Off the Wall Thriller, sometime
and what did you think? I mean,
it's in my
been losing pigment for years before his death, and the patches of depigmentation found during the examination proved that what he had said in the 1993 Oprah interview was completely true. But vitiligo in the Jackson family was not limited to Michael. Members of the extended Jackson family have shown signs of the same condition across generations. This matters because vitiligo is an autoimmune condition. It does not exist in isolation. It is connected to how the immune system functions, and it often appears alongside other autoimmune responses in the same family line. What the medical picture of the Jackson family reveals, when examined carefully, is a genetic inheritance that included a tendency toward autoimmune activity, bodies that worked against themselves in specific ways, under specific kinds of stress. And when you place that biological tendency alongside the extraordinary physical and psychological demands that the Jackson children were placed under from the earliest ages, the picture that emerges is both clearer and more troubling than most public accounts of the family have ever acknowledged. The talent was real. Nobody disputes that. But the biological inheritance that came with that talent, the genetic material passed down through that family line, carried things alongside the gifts that the world was watching on stage. Things that were not visible from the audience. things that took decades to fully reveal themselves. Michael Jackson's health history, examined as a complete picture rather than as a series of isolated incidents, tells a story that his DNA helps explain. The vitiligo was confirmed, but beyond the skin condition, Michael Jackson dealt with a range of physical challenges across his life that fit a recognizable pattern for someone with an underlying autoimmune tendency. His skin was sensitive. His body responded to stress in ways that required significant medical management. His immune system, throughout his adult life, was not functioning in the straightforward way that a person of his age and his resources should have been able to maintain. He was also someone whose body showed the effects of extreme physical demand from a very young age. He began performing professionally as a young
When I'm trying to
child.
hear it, it feels
The
like
rehearsal
somebody's
schedules,
fist is
the
pushed
travel,
into my
the
ears. It's
performance
really
demands,
very
the emotional
difficult.
stress
I know
of
you mean
growing up
well.
in a family where the pressure to perform was constant. All of this was absorbed by a body that was genetically predisposed to respond to stress in particular ways. Medical professionals who have reviewed what is publicly known about Michael Jackson's health history describe a picture of someone whose biological inheritance placed him at greater risk than the average person when subjected to the kind of life he led. The talent and the constitution that made him what he was came from the same source, and that source gave him things that helped him and things that eventually worked against him. Michael Jackson was not the only member of his family whose health history reflected the genetic inheritance of that household. Several of the Jackson siblings have dealt with health challenges over the years that researchers who study the family have noted share certain characteristics. The autoimmune tendency that showed up most visibly in Michael appeared in different forms across the family, different expressions of a shared biological inheritance playing out differently in different lives. Janet Jackson has spoken publicly about health challenges she has faced. Tito Jackson dealt with significant health issues. Jackie Jackson, Marlon Jackson. The extended family history, when mapped carefully, shows a pattern of health challenges that is consistent with a shared genetic background that included certain vulnerabilities alongside the well-documented gifts. This does not mean the family was unhealthy in a general sense. Several of the Jackson siblings have lived long and active lives. The genetic inheritance was not a simple curse. It was a complex mix of tendencies that expressed themselves differently, depending on the specific life circumstances of each person. But the pattern is there, and understanding it changes how you read the health crises that hit the most famous member of the family across his life. They were not random. They were not simply the result of bad decisions or bad luck. They were, at least in part, the expression of a biological inheritance, meeting a set of life circumstances that pushed that inheritance toward its more difficult possibilities. March 26, 1928, Joseph Walter Jackson was born in Fountain Hill, Arkansas. He came from a family that had its own history of physical toughness and physical difficulty. He was a man shaped by the hard circumstances of growing up black in the American South during the Depression era, and by the specific demands of the life he built afterward. Joseph Jackson's own health history includes the kind of challenges that researchers looking at the family's genetic picture find significant. He lived to 89, which speaks to a certain fundamental toughness in that line. But the trajectory of his health in his later years and the specific conditions he dealt with add pieces to the genetic picture of the family. What the paternal line contributed to the Jackson children's DNA was a combination of physical resilience and specific vulnerabilities. The capacity for extraordinary physical output, the ability to perform at high levels under sustained pressure, existed alongside tendencies that under the wrong conditions could become serious problems. Joseph Jackson pushed his children toward the thing they were most gifted at. What he could not have known, what nobody knew at the time, was that the genetic material he passed to those children included not just the capacity for that level of performance, but also the biological cost that performing at that level would eventually extract. May 4, 1930. Catherine Esther Scrouse was born in Clayton, Alabama. She grew up in circumstances that required real physical and emotional endurance. She moved north with her family, eventually settling in the Midwest. She brought with her a musical inheritance and a personal strength that shaped everything the Jackson family became. Catherine Jackson's side of the family contributed its own piece to the genetic picture. The musical ability that showed up so clearly in the Jackson children came significantly from her line. Her own musical talent was real, and it was passed down in ways that expressed themselves most dramatically in Michael, but that were visible across all of her children. Catherine also carried genetic material that researchers looking at the family's health history find relevant. Her own health journey across a long life has included challenges that fit the broader pattern visible in the family. The autoimmune tendencies, the specific ways her body has responded to the demands of a very long and often very difficult life, add to the picture. What Catherine and Joseph together passed to their children was a genuinely complex inheritance. The gifts were real. The musical ability, the physical capacity for performance, the intensity and the drive. These things came from somewhere biological as much as they came from the environment Joseph created. But so did the vulnerabilities. Both came from the same source. Both were written into the same DNA. The question of what Michael Jackson's children inherited from their father's genetic line is one that researchers and the public have approached carefully, partly because the children themselves deserve privacy, and partly because the answers are genuinely complex. Prince, Paris, and Blanket Jackson have grown into adults who are increasingly present in public life. What is observable about their health and their physical characteristics adds to the larger picture of the Jackson family's genetic inheritance across generations. Paris Jackson has been open about her own health and mental health challenges in ways that reflect the kind of courage her father showed when he spoke about his own experiences. The challenges she has described are consistent with the autoimmune and stress response patterns visible elsewhere in the family line. The next generation of the Jackson family carries the same complex inheritance that every generation before them carried. The gifts and the vulnerabilities together, the extraordinary capacity for creative expression alongside the biological tendencies that require careful management. What is different for this generation is not
in the healing process by taking the boy around the grounds of Neverland to Jackson's favorite places.
He had never really climbed a tree, so I had this.
Are now better understood than they were when Joseph and Catherine were raising their children. That knowledge, properly applied, can make a real difference in how the inheritance is managed going forward. Vitiligo, the condition confirmed in Michael Jackson's autopsy, is classified medically as an autoimmune disorder. The immune system attacks the cells responsible for skin pigmentation. It affects roughly 1 to 2% of the global population, and it tends to run in families. More importantly, for understanding the Jackson family picture, vitiligo is significantly associated with other autoimmune conditions. People with vitiligo have elevated rates of thyroid disorders, type 1 diabetes, rheumatoid arthritis, and a range of other conditions where the immune system behaves in ways that work against the body rather than protecting it. Research into the genetics of autoimmune conditions has advanced considerably in recent decades. Specific gene variants have been identified that increase the likelihood of autoimmune responses. These variants are heritable. They pass from parent to child, and they express themselves differently depending on the environmental conditions each person encounters. The extraordinary stress that Michael Jackson's body was subjected to from the earliest years of his life. The physical demands of constant rehearsal and performance starting in childhood, the psychological pressure of growing up in the circumstances he grew up in, the decades of public scrutiny and controversy that followed. All of this represents exactly the kind of environmental pressure that activates and accelerates autoimmune tendencies in people who carry the relevant genetic variants. The science does not reduce Michael Jackson's story to a simple biological explanation. His life was shaped by choices and circumstances and relationships and decisions made by many people over many decades. But the science does provide a framework for understanding why his body responded the way it did to the life he lived. And that framework is written into the DNA of the family he came from. Understanding the genetic picture of the Jackson family changes how you read the story that the public has been told about Michael Jackson for decades. The changes in his appearance that generated so many headlines and so much speculation were, at their foundation, the expression of a genetic condition that he did not choose and could not control. The vitiligo was real. The medical interventions used to manage it were real. And the difficulty of managing a highly visible autoimmune condition while living one of the most scrutinized lives in history was a challenge that most of the people writing headlines about it never tried to understand. The health challenges of his later years, the physical difficulties, the sleep problems, the reliance on medical support that eventually became the central fact of his final months. These things look different when placed against the backdrop of a genetic inheritance that made his body particularly vulnerable to the kind of sustained stress his life subjected it to. This does not excuse every decision made around his medical care. The arrangement that led to his death was wrong and the persons responsible was held legally accountable. But it provides a context that the simple narrative of reckless celebrity behavior never adequately captured. Michael Jackson was a person whose extraordinary gifts and whose significant vulnerabilities came from the same place. From the DNA of a family that produced something the world had never quite seen before and has not quite seen since. Understanding that does not change what happened, but it changes how honestly we can talk about why. The Jackson family's contribution to music is documented and undeniable. The catalog of work produced by the members of that family across 6 decades represents one of the most significant bodies of popular music in history. But the Jackson family's contribution to our understanding of what genetic inheritance means for people who live extraordinary lives is something that has received far less attention. The story of that family, read through the lens of what their DNA carried and how that inheritance expressed itself across different members and different generations, is a story that has things to teach beyond the music. It is a story about the relationship between gift and cost, about how the same biological material can produce both the capacity for greatness and the vulnerability that greatness extracts a price from, about how families carry things across generations that none of them chose and all of them live with. It is a story about what happens when extraordinary biological gifts meet extraordinary external pressure, when a family that carries both remarkable capacities and specific vulnerabilities is placed under the kind of sustained demand that the Jackson family faced from the time the youngest members were small children. The music that came out of that family was real, and it was extraordinary, and so was the cost. Both things are written in the same DNA. Both things are part of the same story, and understanding that story completely requires being willing to look at both. July 29, 1958. A baby was born in Gary, Indiana, carrying the DNA of 2 families, carrying the gifts that DNA contained and the vulnerabilities it contained alongside them, carrying the potential for something the world had never seen, and carrying the biological inheritance that would shape what that potential cost him. What DNA revealed about the Jackson family did not diminish what that family produced. It did not reduce the music or the performances or the legacy to a biological explanation. What it did was add depth to a story that had been told too simply for too long. The Jackson family was extraordinary. Their story is not fully told by the highlights or by the controversies. It is told by the whole picture, the gifts and the costs, the performances and the health challenges, the public story and the biological one running underneath it for generations. Now that you know more of that picture, the question is what you do with it, whether it changes how you hear the music, whether it changes how you understand the life behind it, and whether it changes what you think the world owed the family that gave so much of itself to produce something that will last long after all of them are gone. Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Like this video, subscribe, and turn on notifications, because the full story of the Jackson family is still being written, and there is still more of it worth telling.